episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today we're going to continue our series on learning about Hegel, reading through the Phenomenology of Spirit. So, on the last section, we left off of on sections. We left off on sections 56 through 58. And my description of that section or that those areas was as follows. In these sections, Hegel shows us why picture thinking and argumentation are both incomplete ways of gaining knowledge. Dr. Sadler goes on to say that we'll need to combine the best of both and discard the bad parts of either to do the speculative philosophy that Hegel considers as science. Early on, though, Hegel points out how imposing an external formalism onto a concept robs it of its freedom and ability to move itself. Dr. Sadler had a great metaphor um, for this crafting. When you are working with wood or any other material that has its own shape, you have to work with it and let it tell you how it wants to be worked. This will allow you to get the most out of it. Similarly, with knowledge, working with the concept rather than trying to impose your predetermined ideas on it will be far more likely to grant understanding of that concept's soul. So, yeah. Oh, I had this last part. Overall, it's usually better to not be so rigid in one's understanding of the world or method of understanding the world if you hope to truly understand the world. So I think it's an interesting summary there. I think I was quite tired by the time I wrote this through. So I know I probably could have done this better. Let's see what Dr. Sadler said in his explanation. He says, Hegel begins by noting that logical necessity is revealed to the investigator in the process of investigating the content. Self moving contents develop their own logical form, the form by which they can be grasped in their universality, and thus to simply impose logical form upon them from the outside guarantees not grasping them as they are. What is required instead is the strenuous effort of the notion, that is, attention to the developing concrete content carried out in light of attention to similar development in metaphysical notions. It requires the investigating human subject to be willing to learn from the object of investigation. Hegel also contrasts the conceptual dialectical mode of philosophical work against several other more common modes of thinking: appeal to intuition, common sense and conventional ideas, picture thinking, or Verstellung, as the German word is, and argumentative thinking, or Rasoner, I don't know how you say that. So yeah, of course, Dr. Sadler was way more on point here with his explanation here. Um, so take that as you will. And oh my gosh, I just noticed, sorry, my title is wrong on this. Let me update that before I start this new one here. Um, so it's gonna be a little bit of dead time here. That's why I gotta do my due diligence before I press play. Doing all this live is not the move. Sections 59 through, let's see, we're recovering today. 59 through 60. Yeah. Learning Hegel, original video. Put this link there, and then we'll be good to go. Thank y'all for your patience. I really want to get some new mics and camera and stuff like that. I'm just using my laptop camera. That's why it's so bad quality. My mic as well is just a little headphones mic. It's good for doing little meetings at work, but you know you work with what you got. So thanks for all those that listen to me, despite despite my terrible quality stuff. I I listened back to some of it um earlier today, and it was like, oof, so sorry, so sorry. All right, here we go. So we're all good now. Okay, as always, thanks again for watching with me. Let's begin. if I share my screen there.
There are two aspects of the procedure of argumentation to which speculative thinking is opposed and which call for further notice. First, such thinking adopts a negative attitude towards the content it apprehends. It knows how to refute it and destroy it. That something is not the case is a merely negative insight, a dead end which does not lead to new content beyond itself. In order to have a content once again, something new must be taken over from elsewhere. Argumentation is reflection into the empty I, the vanity of its own knowing. This vanity, however, expresses not only the vanity of this content, but also the futility of this insight itself. For this insight is the negative that fails to see the positive within itself. Because this reflection does not get its very negativity as its content, it is never at the heart of the matter, but always beyond it. For this reason, it imagines that by establishing the void, it is always ahead of any insight rich in content. On the other hand, in speculative thinking, as we've already shown, the negative belongs to the content itself and is the positive, both as the immanent movement and determination of the content, and as the whole of this process. Looked at as a result, what emerges from this process is the determinate negative, which is consequently a positive content as well.
So yeah, speculative thinking, that applying, some trying to think of another word for speculation. Trying to apply some more consideration to, and some more openness, some more freedom to how you think about things, right? Allows you to explore concepts from the negative side, and finding the truth, the positive within that, right? Like, once again, when you think about something, you think about what it's not. And by doing so, you can gain a more solid understanding of what it is, right? That's how the negative side can produce the kind of positive side. So it's interesting.
Section 59 begins by telling us that there are two aspects of the procedure of argumentation, or raisonnieren, which speculative, we've got that up there, begreifen thinking, is opposed to, and which call for further notice. But then Hegel goes and tells us not just about two, but about a number of different aspects of this. So I don't actually think it's that helpful to try, as you're reading this passage, to figure out exactly what the second aspect is, because there's more than one candidate for that. He starts out saying, first, such reasoning adopts a negative attitude towards the content it apprehends. And I've got that represented here. Argumentation, raisonnieren, is being carried out. What does he mean by this term? This is a good point to pause for just a moment. And notice that what we've got here lexically is actually sort of a German loanword coming in from French. And, I don't want to say in every single case, but in many cases when you've got a French or Latinate loanword coming in, and it's being contrasted to something that's, plain old German like Begriff, the German one is going to be the positive one, the one that we want, and the other one is going to be, there's going to be something wrong with it. And what Hegel has in mind by this is the kind of skeptical or constantly questioning, constantly undermining philosophy of the French Enlightenment, also the British Enlightenment, but not the further German Enlightenment. This position of argumentation, of reasoning, of enlightenment, is always able to point out something wrong, something missing, something negative, something lacking in the content. So like he says, it takes a negative attitude towards the experience, towards the subject matter that's being studied. He says it knows how to refute it and destroy it. And I think that we can find plenty of philosophical attitudes in our own time that adopt a similar sort of perspective. If we begin from the unless you prove it to me by some sort of appeal to philosophical intuitions, or what somebody said in this article over here that just was written 20 years ago, and we're taking as being the hallmark for what counts as philosophy, which often happens in analytic philosophy. we're going to reject it. If we can raise any defeaters, if we can raise any counterexamples, if we can come up with any ways to parse what you said so that it could be said a little bit differently and thereby wrong, then we're going to take a negative attitude towards it and say, well, it could be that it's actually some good, but we can't see it at this point. So we have this kind of skeptical attitude available in philosophy, in not just in philosophy, but all across the board in various disciplines and institutions, not just in Hegel's time, but in our own time.
Mm-hmm.
So he's pointing something out to us. He says it takes a negative attitude towards the content that it apprehends. It knows how to refute it, how to destroy it. That something is not the case is a merely negative insight, though. To tell us if that's going to be what philosophy really is. And this is one reason why a lot of people get turned off on philosophy, isn't it? Because they go into a philosophy class and they, at least they think they know something when they go in, and the instructor, leads them through some things, and we find out we don't really know what free will is. We don't really know what, whether we're free or not. We don't even know what determinism is. We can pick whatever examples. We don't know what the good is. And people come out of that and they're like, well, crap, now what am I going to do with this? And very quickly, they come to the conclusion that, well, philosophy is a fun game that you play while the semester goes on, or when you've got nothing better to do. But when we actually get out into the real world, where we do have to make commitments, and we do need to think in terms of content that we're not just going to reject, then I guess philosophy is no use to us. And this is a position that many people arrive at because they only encounter this kind of thinking. So he says, argumentation is reflection into the empty I, that is the reasoning subject. I probably should have put that here. What we're talking about is the subject who's actually carrying this out, the subject who is adopting this critical stance towards everything. And if they want something positive, like he points out, they've got to bring it in from the outside. What does this lead to? A merely negative insight. Or, as he says, vanity. He says, the vanity, however, is the vanity of its own knowing, because it doesn't actually know anything. All it does is knows that things are not the case. But it expresses not only the vanity of this content, it turns the content into kind of a nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It is never at the heart of the matter, but always beyond it, which shows us that what we're talking about here is a vanity or a futility. Not vanity in the sense of pride, but vanity in the sense of, like in Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanity, all is vanities. Everything is worthless. Everything is empty. Everything is futile. And that's all this position can ultimately, on its own, provide. When it works because there's something else going on in addition to it. If you were to think about it in recipe terms, it would be as if all you had was baking powder. Can't do much with that now, can you?
Right.
Add it to some other things and you can make some interesting things happen. This is not without some value, but by itself, taken as the model for philosophy, it's not adequate.
This
So
is great.
says,
I kind of skipped over this whole part about the argumentation and things like that. So again, super grateful for Dr. Sadler.
It ends up being ahead of the matter. It's always able to say, yeah, I can see that this is not going to really work out. This is not going to be what we need.
And I have to say, like, this is something that really irks me about like the whole debate bro YouTube kind of scene, and even folks like Sam Harris and stuff like that. Like they do have some good kind of points and ideas sometimes, but oftentimes it kind of is just seems like it's just for attacking and taking down, um, concepts rather than actually building up a form of knowledge, a basis of knowledge, and um, that especially frustrates me with folks like Sam Harris, right? Because I am one of the folks that also believe that we don't have free will and have a lot of reasons behind that, and I talked about it a lot in some of my videos. But when I was listening to Sam Harris, kind of bring forth these arguments, he tends to do that same thing where he kind of takes it down like, oh, everything you think you know about free will is actually not, and then he just leaves it there. I was just like, okay, so what now? Like what else is there? Like what, you can't take people's, kind of foundation away, kind of assumptions or knowledge or whatever away and then not replace it with something else. Right. And I don't mean to tell people what to think, right? Because again, philosophy is about learning how to think. But the problem with folks like Sam Harris is that he doesn't give you really the tools, right, to build that for yourself. He claim he does. I think some people claim, oh yeah, he's just leaving it up for you. Like, but no, he doesn't because he doesn't really offer up different ideas for you to choose between or understand the different perspectives of, right? He often kind of um either straw man something, right, as opposed to steel manning, or he doesn't, go into depth about the other kind of perspectives out there around free will around any topic. Sometimes he does, don't get me wrong, but usually he does not, at least in my opinion there. And I know people would disagree on that, and we can always get deeper into that, but that was just my personal experience with him. And very and I use him an example because he's like one of the best examples of people who actually have some good stuff to say, unlike many debate bros who are just kind of just like whatever. But he actually has some good stuff to say, but it's kind of lost because he just goes there but doesn't go far enough. Like he uses this argumentation format where he's just like taking these things apart. It's like, oh yeah, it's not that, not that, not that, right? But then you just feel like, okay, so what now? And so what people tend to do, right, is that they form their own ideas, but on a really, really shaky and, you know, crumbly like foundation, right? There's no actual critical thought. They just kind of put in what they with their whatever their assumptions or biases or you know the common parlance of that sort of thing is. Like for instance, for free will, people think, oh, since there's no free will, then we have to believe in nihilism, right? Nothing matters, blah 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 blah. And that's like the is like you see that too when you go look at the comments, when he talks about this stuff, a lot of people are just, oh yeah, that's why when nothing matters, blah 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 blah. Or the people who disagree, like, no, this is why we need, free will because then people are, depressed and this, that, and the other, right? But these are just the common, this is just the surface level things that's underneath, I want to say surface level, but the subdermis level, right? Like free will is like the top surface level kind of perception or kind of assumption, and then under that is like, okay, there is no free will, and therefore nothing matters, right? And then under that is like, oh no, we need free will because people think. But then under that, right, you have to keep going deeper, but people don't go deeper because he doesn't show that there is deeper to go. I guess that's what I'm trying to get to here. Um, so yeah, this is my kind of experience with like this argumentation format, is that when people introduce ideas in such a way, it makes everything seem, kind of surface level and doesn't really supply you with the space and the tools and the foundation to go deeper in there. And I think this is what he's talking about with speculative, that it does this a little bit better. But let's see.
And it's setting itself up in this kind of stance for not apprehending the content. So he says speculative, or begreifende thinking, that which uses the begriff, the concept, the notion, is proceeding in a very different way. He says the negative belongs to the content itself. Instead of it bringing negation to the content, what it does is it approaches the content. It allows the content to actually unfold itself, show its own form, and as it turns out, as we've seen, over and over and over again, it contains negativity. It's self-others. Part of self-movement is this self-othering process. We don't need to go into all that. But what he wants to get at here is by doing that, it eventually produces a new positive content. This is actually what Hegel is going to call determinate negation, which means producing something that's other, something that's new, something that's actually positive. Negation is not purely nullifying or destroying. Negation takes place by way of producing something new, something that's opposed.
Right.
So he says that looked at as a result, what emerges from this process is the determinate negative, which is consequently a positive content as well. You might say, well, how can a negative be a positive? It depends on the relationality, how you're looking at it.
Yep.
In terms of the content that you began with, it's a negation of it. And in terms of the content that you began with, it's also something other, something additional. And in that, it is something positive. And as something positive, it can become its own content. And then it can be a negation of that. And this is the way that the dialectic proceeds.
That's how you get deeper and deeper. I love that.
It can't grasp the dialectic as any sort of progress, and it winds up being stuck in vanity or futility.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well said.
But in view of the fact that such thinking has a content, whether of picture thoughts or abstract thoughts or a mixture of both, argumentation has another side which makes comprehension difficult for it. The remarkable nature of this other side is closely linked with the above-mentioned essence of the idea, or rather it expresses the idea in the way that it appears as the movement, which is thinking apprehension. For whereas in its negative behavior, which we've just discussed, racinative thinking is itself the self which the content to which the content returns, in its positive cognition, on the other hand, the self is a subject to which the content is related as accident and predicate. This subject constitutes the basis to which their content is attached, and upon which the movement runs back and forth. Speculative thinking behaves in a different way. Since the notion is the object's own self, which presents itself as the coming to be of the object, it is not a passive subject inertly supporting the accidents. It is, on the contrary, the self-moving notion which takes its determinations back into itself. In this movement, the passive subject itself perishes. It enters into the differences and the content and constitutes the determinateness, that is, the differentiated content and its movement, instead of remaining inertly over against it. The solid ground which argumentation has in the passive subject is therefore shaken, and only this movement itself becomes the object.
Mm.
The subject
So hold up. Let's touch on that a little bit, right? Um, talking about here the argumentative form, as I'm understanding it, right? His way of knowing, way of thinking, it's like sets things up as like subject. I'm not sure exactly what he means by accident and predicate, but how I'm seeing it's like almost like a hero and villain type of thing, where you have like a clear sides, right? And so you can be like, oh, that's like the classic good versus evil, right? Good. This is good is this and bad is that, and they're on their different sides, right? It's like you're setting these up as like subjects, as things that you can look at and say, okay, that's good, that's bad, you know. Um, but the problem with that, as he said here, he says subject this subject constitutes the basis to which the content is attached and upon which the movement runs back and forth. Speculative. Yeah, so the movement is like just kind of like a ping pong back and forth, right? You have the hero and villain; they're just fighting back and forth. Um, this is why you can have this binary thinking of like right or wrong, right? But in speculative thinking, it says, which presents itself coming to be of the object. It is not a passive subject inertly supporting the accident. It is, on the contrary, the self-moving notion, right? Which takes determinants back into itself. So instead of saying good and evil, when you have these two sides going back and forth, you have okay, a person, I my experience or whatever can have good in it, and it can also have evil within there, right? Something good taken far enough can be evil, and something evil, taking a different way, whatever, can be good, right? So within any idea, you can have both concepts, um, and that going back and forth instead of just ping ponging, that going back and forth is like a cyclical motion. It's a movement, right? It's a little um, locomotion that allows you to use these differences to claw yourself forward, to go deeper and really explore the full space of these ideas. So I really like how he said that there. Did I touch on this? Did he said this already? Yeah, yeah. But I like this too. In the movement, the passive subject itself perishes, right? It's not passive anymore. It's an active experience, an active um, process. It enters into the differences in the content and constitutes the determinateness. That is the differentiated content and its movement instead of remaining inertly over against it. Because remember, inertly is just sitting there, just not really moving. The solid ground, which argumentation has the passive subject, is therefore shaken. I love that so much because once again, when you have these binary ideas of just good and evil or this, that, and the other, this or that, right? It seems like solid ground. It seems like, oh yeah, I know what I'm talking about. All right, it's this thing, right? But then when you actually explore it and you make it move and you look at the different perspectives around it, you start to wobble a little bit. You say, okay, why are you questioning me so much? Why are you doing this? Why and then you can smash them together and say, oh no, the hero is the villain is the hero, and then the whole world is blown, right? And you could do that with almost anything. Um, that's appropriate for the situation, in terms of freedom and constraints, or government and no government and this, that, and the other. Like uh it's really fascinating how a lot of our knowledge, a lot of our concepts, right, can hold within themselves the quote unquote opposite, right, the quote unquote enemy of that thing. um it's just fascinating stuff right here.
object that fills the content ceases to go beyond it. It cannot have any further predicates or accidental properties. Conversely, the dispersion of the content is thereby bound together under the self. It is
Hmm.
not the universal which, free from the subject, could belong to several others.
Mm.
Thus, the content is, in fact, no longer a predicate of the subject, but is the substance, the
Mm.
essence, and the notion of what is under discussion. Picture thinking, whose nature it is to run through the accidents and predicates, and which, because they're nothing more than accidents and predicates, rightly goes beyond them, is checked in its progress.
Mm.
Since that which has the form of a predicate and a proposition is the substance itself, it suffers, as we might put it.
So I know he's doing some sort of clever thing with this breakdown of predicates and accidents, and I'm looking forward to Dr. Sal's thing because I'm totally lost on that. Like, I mean, I kind of get it of like from the metaphor that I was thinking, but I'm not a literature like buff, so I can barely tell you how human like how English. I was gonna say human goodness, it's terrible. How English sentences work in terms of past participle and subject predicate. I get the other like predicate, is obviously the action, like the verb, subject is the noun, but I'm not sure what he means by accident. Um, Maybe adjective or something like that. I don't know. I don't know.
To counter
We'll get
thrust.
into it.
Starting from the subject as though this were a permanent ground, it finds that since the predicate is really the substance, the subject has passed over into the predicate, and by this very fact has been sublated.
Mm.
And since in
And
this way,
how I see this, because I don't really how I see this is the way it says here: the subject has passed over into the predicate, right? The noun has become the verb. So the thing that was the thing that you were acting on has become the thing that you're using to act, or something like that, right? I think it's a fascinating idea.
what seems to be the predicate has become the whole in the independent mass, thinking cannot roam at will, but is impeded by this weight.
Mm.
Usually, the subject is first made the basis as the objective fixed self. Thence the necessary movement to the multiplicity of determinations or predicate proceeds. Here, that subject is replaced by the knowing I itself, which links the predicates with the subject holding them. But since that first subject enters into the determinations themselves and is their soul, the second subject, that is the knowing I, still finds in the predicate what it thought it had finished with and got away from, and from which it had hoped to return into itself. And instead of being able to function as the determining agent in the movement of predication, arguing back and forth whether to attach this or that predicate, it is really still occupied with the self of the content, having to remain associated with it instead of being for itself.
Right. Exactly. So again, it's
Section 60, which
about a thing of self-exploration and how delve into these ideas and move yourself forward through these ideas by kind of identifying with it, or seeing it for what it is rather than seeing it for what you want it to be, right? That makes sense. I think that's what he's saying here in it's very simplistic terms. Uh,
is quite long, also has a lot of things going on in it. There's, so to speak, a lot of balls in the air being juggled at the same time. So part of what we want to do is pay very close attention to what exactly is being said of what. And there's a little bit of irony in my saying it like that, because what are we doing? We're talking about what is being predicated of what subjects in Hegel's own account. We also want to be very conscious of which different approaches are able to accomplish what, and what they're not able to accomplish for the two deficient approaches here, argumentation or Resonieren, and picture thinking or Vorstellung. And we also want to think why it is that they're not able to do that. And in Hegel's view, this actually has to do with what is going on when they are thinking their way through these logical categories of subject, predicate, accident, what's also going on behind the scene in terms of the thinking, the apprehending, the acting subject, the self, the human being who's doing this, for whom all of this stuff is, you might say, out there in the world, but also there linguistically and in thought. If we want to go back, this is sort of a little digression, to Aristotle's metaphysics and categories and everything else in between that's supposed to lead you from one to the other, Aristotle was, he was one of the first thinkers to systematically grasp and try to work out the implications of the fact that being and thought and language, while not exactly coinciding or mirroring each other, are interconnected. And that the clues that are present in one help us to better understand the other. What we do in one of these areas modifies what's going on in another. Hegel is trying to work out this insight and make it much more rigorous. So let's look at what he has to say. So he said he's talking still about argumentation. He says, but in view of the fact that such thinking has a content, whether of picture thoughts or abstract thoughts, or a mixture of both, argumentation has another side which makes comprehension difficult for it. The remarkable nature of this other side is closely linked with the above-mentioned essence of the idea. Rather, it expresses the idea in the way that it appears as the movement, which is thinking apprehension. Remember, we were talking earlier in some of the sections preceding this about the idea, and Hegel backtracked that to nous, and then he cast that back forward into the Aristotelian species or kind or determinate universality. So how does rationative, as he's calling it here, argumentative thinking work itself out? He says, in its positive cognition, the self is a subject to which the content is related as accident and predicate. So you notice I've got here subject. When we're looking at a matter, and by the way, there's sort of a play on words or deliberate equivocation, intentional ambiguity going on with this term subject here. Because subject can mean one thing in relation to accidents, another thing in relation to predicates, and another thing when we're talking about agency. All of these are wrapped up in this, and Hegel's kind of playing off of these. So he says the subject constitutes the basis to which the content is attached, and upon which the movement runs back and forth. This is the way we normally think about when we're doing, say, formal logic or even diagramming sentences. This is the way we normally think about the relation between subjects and their qualities, as we would say. Hegel's not using the term quality here, and we'll see why in just a few minutes. I represented this graphically for a reason. When we talk about subject, in Greek hupokimenon, or in Latin subjectum, what we're thinking in terms of is some substance, something, about which then we can say other things. And we can think of it in terms of the essence of the thing, the what it is, and then accidents. For example, to use an Aristotelian example, I'm a human being. The fact that I have, we actually say white skin, but it's not white, it's pinkish, right? Pinkish, yellowish, undertone of blue to it, brown hair, certain height. These are all things you can predicate about me, but they can also be understood as accidents. You could change those, and I could still remain the kind of being that I am, because there's other human beings that don't have my skin color or hair color or height or age or position, where they are, they're not on video. We can run down all these different accidental properties. And this is one way of thinking about things. These are less closely connected to what the thing is. This is what the thing is, right? Now, another way of thinking about it is in terms of predicates. When we say Greg Sadler is 44 years old, which currently is true, wouldn't have been true a month ago, we're predicating
Happy
age,
birthday.
a number of me, and we're saying that that's something about what it is that I am. Now, when we already have in mind a given...
Head up. When was this? September 27th. Oh, he's born in September too. He's just well, I'm not sure if he recorded this on the day he published it. But if so, we might have birthdays very close to each other. That's very interesting. So I looked it up real quick while he was talking, and just if you didn't catch that, what he's talking about with the accident is, for those that don't know, like myself, it seems to be like a thing of contingency, right? The entity or substance has contingently, without which the substance can retain its identity. An accident does not affect its essence. It does not mean an accident as used in common speech, like a incident or normally harmful. Theories of accident is of properties that are not essential to the substances in which they occur, and as much as an accident do. Yeah, so very interesting concept there. I like this right here: property and contingency. Like the properties of a thing, but it's not the thing itself. All right. Good stuff there. Oops. It's not it. There we go.
given subject, and we're just sort of like adding ideas to it. We've already got the outlines, we have already got the thing in mind, and we're saying, do I want to be a person who's eating steak tonight or a person who's eating potatoes tonight? Those would be accidents, right? Which we could predicate. Nothing important is really going on. Nothing really life-changing, consciousness-changing, anything like that, because we're taking the subject for granted as something that's known. What about when we're trying to figure out, what is that? What is the subject? How does it work? Is it what we think it is? Now we're dealing with something quite different, because now the predicates really matter a lot. And among the accidents, among the things that we can see about it, we might want to try to distinguish which of them are actually closer to what that thing is. And if we strip away all of the predicates, all the accidents, what are we left with? Are we left with a human being? Or are we left with a sort of nothing, something like an armature just hanging there in logical space? That's the question that Hegel says causes problems for reasoning, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth. Why? Well, in part because it doesn't realize that it itself is engaged in this process, and it also doesn't realize the importance of the predicates. So what if we're doing speculative thinking, begreifende thinking? What if we're thinking things through their notion?
I'm sorry, just so I make sure I understand what the hell he's talking about when he says predicate. I have an idea, but let me search this up. Predicate is a property that a thing can either possess or lack. Predicates in the existence of God. When people assert that God exists, they are not saying that there is a God and he possesses the property of his existence. First, an act of judgment when one term is subsumed under another. In the sense that the cat is sleeping in that or subject. Category. So this seems to be a property as well. Dialectic questions. I like that one. Can be divided into 4 categories: definition, property, genus, and accident. Interesting. So this versus accident. Logical distinction for our purposes between accident. Now, if I had more time, obviously I would actually dive into all of these sources rather than just looking at the summary here. But for time's sake, I'm just trying to get a kind of brief understanding. Said of and present in. That's an interesting thing there too. I don't know. I have to dive into this more later. I think I get it though.
He says, since the notion is the object's own self, which presents itself as the coming to be of the object, it is not a passive subject inertly supporting the accidents. It is, on the contrary, the self-moving notion which takes its determinations back into itself. Now, one way of thinking about this is that the subject is kind of swallowing up all these accidents, all these predicates, all the things that you can say, you know, even the relationships that it has to other things. But another way that Hegel frames it, that he focuses on here, is that the subject itself is sort of self-giving. It is moving out into its predicates, he says. He says, the passive subject itself perishes. It enters into the differences and the content. This is what the content is, the predicates. So to say, you know, for example, we're doing theology, God is good. God becomes sort of just a meaningless name until you can figure out, well, what the hell does good mean? And then once you start exploring that, now you actually start to know what that is, because this is sort of leached into its own predicates. And there might be multiple predicates at work. How can God be just and merciful at the same time? Or we could ask, what is the state? Or what makes things beautiful? Or what's going on in this particular kind of music? And we begin with the subject, and then we start predicating, and the subject, by a kind of intellectual osmosis or self-donation, becomes its predicates. So he says, the subject that fills its content ceases to go beyond it and cannot have any further predicates or accidental properties. We start to realize what it is by grasping things in terms of quality. Not in terms of substance or being or subject apart from quality, but we grasp quality as having an ultimate metaphysical priority over any other determination that we would like to think of. Place, time, agency, passivity, all these other categories, including number, quantity, and including substance, ousia, in the classic Aristotelian text. So he says, the passive, the solid ground which argumentation has in the passive subject is therefore shaken. Only the movement itself becomes the object. So he says, the dispersion of the content is thereby bound together under the self. It is not the universal which, free from the subject, could belong to several others. The content is in fact no longer a predicate of the subject, but is the substance. It is the concept. The predicate is where the side of the concept is. The notion. And he says, picture thinking likes to understand things just by looking at all the accidents or predicates, and it sort of, you know, helps to sketch them in, sort of like color by numbers. It doesn't know what to do with this here. It says, that which has the form of a predicate in a proposition is the substance itself. It suffers, as we might put it, a counterthrust. Starting from the subject as though this were a permanent ground, which it's not. That's the thing. What gives the subject its permanent ground is the person, the thinker, who is apprehending this. All of this is taking place for and in consciousness, and in this process, consciousness is coming to know what the thing in its concept or notion truly is in relation to itself. So he says, it finds that since the predicate is really the substance, the subject is passed over into the predicate, by this very fact has been sublated. So what we have going on here is actually the process of what Hegel calls Aufhebung. We translate that in English as sublation. And that means the development of something through negation into something else, something different, something greater, something that includes and incorporates it. We can think of this in terms of the development of shapes of consciousness, of the Gestalten through the dialectical process. The new one that develops incorporates much of what has gone before, at least in outline, but sort of leaves behind the detritus. This also happens at the level of subject-predicate logic, Hegel would say, if we're following the speculative process. So pleasure is the good. What's going on there? The classic statement of hedonism, right? Should we regard it in terms of pleasure being the subject, and it has the quality of being the good, but then perhaps we should actually turn it around. Maybe the good is pleasure.
Mm.
And one, if we follow this out, we're not going to try to do that right now. We
Hmm.
could follow this out and look at it dialectically, and we would find that not only can pleasure be understood as something good, not only can the good be understood as pleasure, but also all sorts of openings to the negative are going to occur in this as well, where we have to say, but wait a second, aren't there good and bad pleasures? The
Right.
dialectic that, for example, gets carried out in Plato's works or Aristotle's works. In any case, he says, it's been sublated and sensed in this way, what seems to be the predicate has become the whole in the independent mass. Thinking cannot roam at will, but is impeded by this weight. So we see that two different kinds of thinking that we've now talked about quite a bit. Raisonieren, argumentative, rationative thinking, which doesn't actually have a foundation for itself, but is sort of a loose, free activity, which unfortunately lapses into vanity as a result, and can't handle a dialectical approach to subject, predicate, accident, those sorts of things,
Hmm.
on the one hand. On the other hand, picture thinking, Vorstellung, wanting to imagine everything in terms of images, in terms of things that it can wrap its head around, and its eyes around, and its hands around, and say things can only really be this way. Both of those are going to be stymied by what speculative or dialectical, begreifende, working with the concept, the notion, the begriff, thinking actually does. So Hegel is trying to caution us at this point against lapsing back into those not deficient in all cases, but deficient in this case, modes
Hmm.
of thought.
Insufficient for this foundation of philosophy. Beautiful, beautiful. I really like this one again, as always. And like, when do I not like it at this point? Hegel just seemed to be a great thinker. And again, we're only in the preface. We're only in the preface. We got a long way till we get to the actual chapter one, and I've learned so much already. So incredibly, incredibly grateful for Dr. Sadler here doing this, because I honestly would not have, read through this book. Be honest with you, but this was great, and I'm looking forward to next week once again. So I hope you have learned something from it too, or you know, just follow me to this point. Let's keep going. Have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.